Patricia, thank you so much. And thank you, Malaprops. What a treat it is to be here in person at Malaprops in this beautiful store after so many months and years of not being able to do that. It's really a treat. And we're so glad that Malaprops has come through the pandemic with wonderful flying colors and that we still have this amazing bookstore.
Amen. Well, I'm going to ask you some questions, but before I ask you some questions, first I'm going to say that Heather and I met Heather 20 years ago or so. She took a writing class with me in the Great Smokies. And I think Maggie Marshall was maybe in that class, and there were some other great writers. But I just remember that was one of my first classes. And I read one of Heather's stories and I thought, shit, what am I gonna do? You know, like, what kind of suggestions am I gonna make? This is so good. Like, and so I'm sure, you know, I probably suggested she move some commas around. But it wasn't like, and so that was my introduction to Heather. And then she was in that class for a while, and it was just such a pleasure to get to meet her and work with her. And then we've known each other through different iterations over the years, when you taught in the Great Smokies, and then when you started the Flatiron Writers. And that has meant so much to me. But what is so cool to me now is to be here with this book, with you come all that way over those years. And here you are with The Puppeteer's Daughter. So it means a lot to me, for me to be here.
Well, it means everything to me. And Tommy's giving you his version. My version is I took Tommy's class repeatedly over about 4 semesters because his feedback was so good. And almost all of the stories in my short story collection, McMullen Circle, are stories that I wrote in his class and got feedback on. And I still have a box in my closet with Tommy's notes on all of those stories. So he's a mentor and a friend, and I really am so happy that he agreed to be my conversation partner.
Absolutely. Well, so first I wanted to say how much I love The Puppeteer's Daughter. I think it's a beautiful spellbinding book in more ways than one. It's funny and complex and full of heart. And I love the interweaving of the fairy tales and the puppetry and how you managed to create such a magical world, which is at the same time full of depth and empathy and great humor. It's a funny book in a lot of ways. It's also an emotional book and is about hard things, yet it's a lot of fun to read, which I think is a sort of a rare thing. I mean, I read books, you know, like good books sometimes, and it's like, oh. You know? But this book isn't like that at all. It's just like, I just was taken, and it was a lovely experience. And I love all the surprising connections and how you always keep the readers on their toes. And I loved everything about it, and I'm excited to talk about it. Although Flannery O'Connor says, when somebody asks what a story is about, the only proper thing is to tell them to read it. So be sure and get this book and read it. But having said that, maybe I can ask you to tell us what it's about.
Sure. So it's about an aging famous puppeteer, a contemporary of Jim Henson, who has 3 adult daughters by 3 different women. And he has dementia. And at his 80th birthday party, he announces to his 3 daughters that there's a 4th. And they think that it's the dementia talking until they find a torn paternity test and a will that places conditions on their inheritance. So they with varying degrees of enthusiasm, begin to search for the fourth sister and try to fulfill the will conditions. And as they do that, they become more sisterly to one another, and also come to terms with their relationship with their father, who's not a perfect human being. So
Right.
that summarizes it pretty well.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah.
Oh, and there's puppets in it. There's lots of puppets. And one or two fairy tales as well.
So one thing, I love the dedications in the book, which are your hands are exactly like my hands. And I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit in terms of the book.
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to write a father-daughter story because my dad was, and it's his birthday today, actually. Today's my dad's birthday. My dad was a wonderful but odd person. And so, you know, in middle age, I had some things to work out, and I knew I wanted to write a father-daughter story, but I didn't have the context of puppeteering. And I went to visit my dad, who did have dementia in his later years. And I was sitting there talking to one of my siblings, kind of talking over, you know, past my dad, because he didn't have a lot to contribute to the conversation. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, he said to me, "Your hands are exactly like my hands." And he's right. They are exactly like his hands. My face, my eyes, my smile, everything else is exactly like his. But I love that he had just made this realization from looking at me that my hands were exactly like his hands. And I started thinking about professions that use the hands, and some memories of puppets that my dad did with us when we were small, and then arrived at, oh, I'll write a book about puppets and puppeteers. So, there you go.
And that's what it is. I mean, puppetry is at the heart of the novel now. And in some ways, the puppets are characters themselves, which is very cool. So can you talk about that? Like how you got into the whole puppet thing? I mean, it's one thing to have that realization with your dad. It's another to write a novel, which is so steeped in puppetry and puppets.
Yeah, so it was fun to research, as you might imagine. I don't know a lot about puppetry, I know a lot more now than I did 2.5 years ago. But when I started this, I decided I would, you know, Google puppeteer festivals near me to try to see if I could maybe go to one, maybe talk to some puppeteers. And it turned out that the Puppeteers of America Southeast Regional Conference was being held at Warren Wilson down the road,
Whoa.
15 miles away. So I got in touch with the chairperson that year, a puppeteer here named Keith Schubert, that some of you may be familiar with. He does Toy Box Theater. And to ask him, can I attend some things a la carte, and he volunteered to get together with me and have a beer and talk to me about puppetry. For like a couple of hours, we talked about puppetry, which was incredibly valuable. Then I went to the Puppeteers Conference, which was great. All kinds of puppetry, shadow puppets made out of roadkill, people walking around with puppets on their hands, body puppets, just everything you can imagine. So met a lot of other puppeteers there, saw some really wonderful puppetry, met Hobie Ford, who is another wonderful puppeteer who lives here, who does beautiful rod puppetry. Attended a marionette stringing class with the director of the National Marionette Theater. And that kind of got me started. So I would say I still speak puppet about as well as I speak French, which means I can, in French, I can like order dinner and ask for a hotel room, but not discuss philosophy. So I did have some puppeteers read over parts of the manuscript. Puppeteer Philip Huber was nice enough to read over the bits about marionettes. Philip is a wonderful marionettist. He did the puppetry for being John Malkovich, if you recall the puppets in that, and was so sweet to, look at it and give me some advice about things that I hadn't quite gotten right. So
wow.
I also listened to hours and hours and hours of puppetry podcasts. There's a couple of really good puppetry podcasts. One is called Puppeteers, where they interview, professional puppeteers. And another one that had stopped before I started doing my research, but the episodes were still available, was called Felt Up.
And then there is the dedication to your mom, which is about claiming the artistic life, right?
Yeah, my mom was a writer, or is a writer. She published 9 young adult books from the time I was in first grade to the time I was in college, and was just so matter of fact about it that she really showed me the possibilities of claiming a life as a writer, which was invaluable. So yeah, she's the reason I'm a writer.
Mm-hmm. And that's what the book is about in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I wanted to write about kind of the idea of creativity on 2 levels. Another thing I'm working through, not just the father-daughter thing, but the whole being a creative person in our society thing.
Yeah.
It's a very therapeutic book for me. But yeah, so there's 2 parts of that, I think, for those of us who want to have a creative life. One is, how do any of us claim a creative life? How do we make time for writing or art or music when we've got family and jobs and illness and whatever else? And then also for people like me who are foolish enough to try to do it at a professional level, how do you keep on and persevere when you're being held to a definition of success that the world defines? How do you keep going if you don't make the New York Times bestseller list or have the sort of material success that people expect you to have? So those were some things that I wanted to deal with in the book.
Well, I just think it's a huge part of that book. I mean, I think that you're a lawyer. I mean, you're a lawyer and you have this big, hard job, and then you're doing this other really hard thing. And to pull that off seems like, anybody who's an artist or who's trying anything creative, there's always that tension. But it seems like in your case, it's a really big tension. And the book is, in a lot of ways, about how the various characters find their creative life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 3 sisters in the book all have different attitudes towards creativity. One of them has completely renounced it because her father valued his creative life over time with her as a child. And one really wants to be creative all the time, but is saddled with running her father's creative company. And then the third daughter doesn't view herself as creative, and yet she's a cake decorator. And her cakes are her art, even though she doesn't understand it. So they all have different attitudes towards it. I will tell you one secret about the book is I put my lawyer self in the book.
Yeah, you did.
I took all the creativity out of her and just put the lawyer half in the book and gave her a little cameo. So if you read about a character who has prematurely gray hair and might be a little plumper than she used to be, but yeah, and has big ears, then that's who that is.
One thing I've noticed is that your books often have, all 3 of them have several points of view. Like Under the Mercy Trees is from different points of view. And then your short story collection is a school, but it's different people at the school, different points of view. And this has many points of view. And I just wondered, is that something you consciously do, or has that just been a tendency that you don't know why?
A tendency. That sounds like an illness.
Yeah.
Some
Well,
kind.
no, I don't mean it like that. Just, you do it. You don't know why.
I often have fallen into that because it's such a easy thing. It's an easy way to tell a story is through multiple points of view. So in this book, I've kind of got a little bit of an omniscient point of view going on because fairy tales are told in that
Right.
point of view. But then I go into each of the daughters, their consciousness, and then also tell some from from Walter, the puppeteer's point of view. You will be proud of me, though. I'm working on a sequel to Under the Mercy Trees now that only has one point of view.
I mean, I think it's a great thing. I mean, I think that it gives you a rounded sense of that world, to have these various points of view. I noticed it. So,
Coming from my writing teacher, that's
right. And another thing, in my limited experience of writing novels, it's been, some people might think, well, you write one novel, you write another novel. You write one novel, you can write another novel. But for me, it's like every novel comes with its own set of problems or challenges. And I just wondered what those might have been when you were writing this, if you had that.
I totally agree with you. I think I only have one child, but I've heard that people who have more than one child, the children, it's like you're starting over from scratch because your second child or your third child are so different from the ones that came before. And every book has its own personality. What was the big challenge in this one? I wrote short. So I needed to, when I got done with the first draft, I needed to expand on some things and had to make choices about what I would expand on.
Mm.
And there must have been other things wrong with it because my agent sent it back to me like 4 times for like a total overhaul, and to the point where if she had done it one more time, I think we would have had words. But her points were valid, and ultimately we got it into shape.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the novels need those problems, it's what they need to be a novel. But I just find it, so other things you'd like to talk about?
I'd love to read some.
Okay.
Question, can I hold the mic and read at the same time? That'll be the.
I could hold the mic. That'd be weird.
I think I can do it.
Okay.
I think I can do it. All right. If I drop something, you'll forgive me, right? Okay. So this is a scene where Cora, who is the heir apparent, the youngest daughter, she's beautiful, she's a puppeteer herself, and she visits her father in the nursing home. And puts on a puppet show for his entertainment. Cora took her puppets out of her suitcase and assembled them. Walter's eyes widened in delight. The little woman who shared his table perked up and leaned forward to look. Cora slipped the puppet on her right hand and put a fur hat on his head. She would operate her female puppet, a woman in a Victorian dress, with her left hand. She lay a third puppet, a boy, on the table to trade out when the story called for him. She worked the puppet so that Walter and the old woman could both see. There was once a sound seeker, she said. She had to swallow around the lump in her throat to continue. There was once a sound seeker who could find lost sounds. The burble of a long, dry spring, the trill of spring peepers to cheer a winter's day, the splash of a stone skipped 6 times on childhood water. If he walked and was quiet, the sounds would come to him like birds, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in days. Once it took a year to find a boy's sweet soprano lost after his voice changed. When the sound seeker found it, the voice was tired and hungry, but excited with stories to tell. The client, the boy's mother, wept with happiness. The sound seeker could find any sound, but words, lost, misheard, or forgotten, were his mainstay. Promises mouthed across a crowded train platform as the train blew its whistle. Endearments murmured at waking when the ears weren't primed to understand. Wisdom spoken in a visitation dream, then lost when the sleeper rolled over on the pillow. It's the change of position, he cautioned. The slosh of cranial fluids washes the dream away. Lie still and remember before you move. His clients sought lyrics to songs, that one ingredient for a secret family recipe, directions to treasure they had buried, but mostly these words, I love you. Those three little syllables seem to get misplaced more than any others, he would say. They are quite my bread and butter. It was those three words that led a woman to the sound seeker's shop on a sultry summer afternoon. The heat had caused her to remember a night long ago when she and her lover made love in the park across from her mother's house. She on his lap, her striped dress pulled up above her thighs, street lamps illuminating the park's fountain, but allowing her and her friend the cover of shadow. Walking back, her lover took her hands and danced her along the middle of the road. He said something to her in Spanish, a language he knew from his travels. She didn't catch it and asked him to repeat it, but he wouldn't. If he had, she might have understood. She knew the word amor and could have listened for it on second repetition. But he wouldn't speak, perhaps already regretting the utterance, if what he said was, in fact, I love you. She had forgotten that night and that lover, but as today's humidity tugged her hair into curls, she felt a fierce yearning for both. The bell over the door tinkled when she entered the sound seeker's shop. He was speaking to another customer, a bereft young man. I cannot help you if your father never spoke the words. The young man ducked past the woman and out the door in tears. The woman told the sound seeker what she wanted. Since the words were spoken in another tongue, I will have to unbend them when I find them in order for you to understand, he said. There will be a small additional fee. She readily agreed, and the sound seeker set off in search of her lover's words. He found them easily in a tree near the park where they were first spoken. He coaxed them down and sent a message to the woman to come for them. When she arrived at the shop, the sound seeker was holding her lover's words. Are you sure you want to hear them? He asked. I cannot be responsible if he was asking you to pass the milk. The woman held still for a moment, considering her choice. When her lover left that night for a 3-month voyage, she was important to him. When he returned, she wasn't. She met his ship thinking she would have him to herself. The smell of tropical travel was strong on his body. He had her drive the carriage to a homecoming party for his traveling companions. At the party was the ship captain's young daughter, whom he had comforted on their travels when a local man overstepped his bounds and frightened her. The woman's lover had saved the girl, and she worshiped him. He liked being worshiped. The woman's lover had spoken his words to her in summer, and they had dissipated on a humid breeze. If he had uttered them in winter, maybe they would have frozen in the air long enough for her to hear him say he loved her. She nodded to the sound seeker, and he began to untwist the sound gently so its strands wouldn't break with their bending back. The woman leaned close, cupping her ears. This time she would not miss the words. Cora lowered the puppets to her lap. Walter clapped his hands. Bra, bra. Bravo, Cora prompted him. Bravo, he echoed. The old woman stared at the now silent puppets, rapt. Her lips moved in an oh. Cora leaned close and could just make out her words. Beautiful, beautiful. Any questions? Terry Roberts threatened to ask me about King Lear, but he's not going to do that.
I just took my mask down, sorry. Yeah. So has Lear been imposed on you, or did you actually think about Lear?
So
Tell us about.
there are many members of my writing group here tonight, which I really appreciate. And they know that it was just a joke. It was a gag. People would ask me what the book was about as I was writing it. And I would say, oh, it's King Lear with puppets. And so when we got ready to submit it, I was joking around with my agent and I said, just pitch it as King Lear with puppets. And by God, she put that in the query letter. So then the publisher, when they're getting the marketing materials together, they're like, can you, they sent me these questions that I would answer in writing, and they'd send it to bookstores and all this kind of thing. They're like, tell us about King Lear and the connection of King Lear. And I'm like, it was just King Lear with puppets. It was just a joke. But, I mean, King Lear, as I understand it, is based on even older fairy tales about father kings who fail their daughters in some way. There's always 3 daughters. So in a way, we're all kind of tapping into the same archetype, I guess. But yeah, I was not reading Shakespeare as I was writing the book.
Other questions, y'all?
Oh, I have one that adds on to that. So I would agree with you that Shakespeare had an obsession with fairy tales and folk tales, as I do. So tell me, why, I don't want you to give me spoilers, but was there any reason that you chose the ones that you did in the book that you can explain without giving a spoiler? Was there something pivotal about them? Some kernel.
So the question is, why did I choose to use fairy tales, and why did I choose the ones that I did? And are you talking about the ones that are original to me or the ones that I drew on?
Well, see, I haven't had the opportunity to read the books. No spoilers.
So the fairy tales serve a few purposes. One of the characters, Cora, performs fairy tales, alternate fairy tales, as part of her creative work. And some of the fairy tales deal with the creativity theme, so look for that. And some of them deal with sisters. So that's the other thing to look for in the fairy tales that I chose. And fairy tales are just so fun to read and write. I had to stick some of them in there.
Other questions? I have one other thing. I was just thinking about Walter and the puppet master, and how he's such a great character, and how you show his complexity through flashbacks and through memory, because he's got dementia now and he's just not there. And that's just really interesting, because as the book progresses, we see him more in the past through the home movies and the different things. And whereas the daughters are sort of developing, in real time. And so it's just this cool thing that I really like about how he sort of emerges over the course of the novel as this very endearing, sweet, but hard sometimes guy. I really like that.
Thank you. He's very flawed, not thawed. I guess he's flawed too. He's quite flawed, but I do hope I redeem him in the end. That's a challenge, writing somebody with dementia. And as we were revising it, actually, the reason there's a prologue in the book is because my agent thought it would be good for readers to see him before the dementia overcame him. To see him early on when he still had his faculties about him. So we decided to move that bit to the front to kind of orient people that way.
And you weave that in throughout, though.
Yeah. I hope you end up disliking him less at the end than you do at the beginning.
We had another
LG, yes.
You know, it's interesting because that was my question. Why did you choose to have the father have dementia? What did that add to this character?
Yeah, and I think the reason I chose that is because of my own experiences with my dad having dementia in the last, 5 or 6 years of his life. And have the challenge of daughters, it's challenging for children to get to know their parents anyway. But when a parent has dementia and the time for asking questions has passed, that makes it even more challenging. And you kind of have to find a way to fill in the blanks that you're never going to get real answers to. So that's why I chose that.
Well, it's beautiful.
How do you choose your subject material? Is it something that you relate to in your own life, or is it something you draw from others?
So how do I choose my material? Is it something drawn from my own life or something that I get from elsewhere? These weird ideas just come to me and start dancing in my head, and they join with other weird ideas that are dancing in my head. I always have memory, my own memories are always in there, and then I feel like I have permission to distort them horribly for the purposes of the story. So, I wouldn't describe my fiction as autobiographical, but there's always little seeds of reality, and then I feel like I have permission to just make, change them up and lie. That's what fiction writers do. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, just curious, because you had to do so much research on the idea of a puppeteer is such a unique creative art form. Actors become other people, but within their own bodies and themselves. This is someone who actually, they have to split themselves into a whole other external being. Having been at the convention and doing all that, were there any insights that you had about the kind of person, psychology of someone to choose that? Or were there any themes in that really stood out for you?
So the question, which you probably hear because Steve has a nice loud voice, was in terms of puppeteers, like, is there a certain type of person that is attracted to that art form? What I learned from researching puppetry is that almost no puppeteers started out to be puppeteers. They all found their way into it through other means, either toy collecting or acting or, visual arts or building or whatever. I think the type of person who becomes a puppeteer, I truly came out of this experience with an incredible respect for the amazing creativity that puppeteers exercise. When in my genre of fiction, all I have to do is work with words. That's all I have to do. Once in a while, I might illustrate some of my work. But puppeteers, they engineer, they perform, they sing, they sew, they glue, they design, they write plays, they do it all. It is truly the most creative art form that I have ever encountered. So I would say that's the answer, is that people who are so creative find it to be an attractive art form. And I'll tell you one little thing. As I was writing the book, I needed to create some conflict between two types of puppeteers. I wanted marionetteists and hand puppeteers to be rivals and not respect each other and be, kind of disdainful of each other, because Walter Gray, my puppeteer, is married to another puppeteer and their marriage was going south, and I needed for that conflict to be there. So I kept asking these real puppeteers in real life, hey, is there any conflict between these two puppeteers? And there is none. There is no conflict. There's nothing but mutual support and admiration. And a lot of puppeteers do more than one type of puppetry. So I had to that is a pure invention, because my art form requires conflict. No reality, no basis of reality.
wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your writing process and how it might have changed across the books that you've written. And I want to invite Tommy to weigh in on that as well.
Mine has definitely changed. You know, my first book took 10 years. Nobody was waiting for it. And I had lots of hits and misses. And then I wrote a few that were so bad I couldn't publish them. And then I wrote the short story collection. And then I wrote this one. I finished a first draft right before the pandemic hit. And I will say that, number one, it was a good thing that during the pandemic, I was revising and not trying to come up with new stories, because I think that's easier in some ways. The pandemic really derailed my writing practice. And only recently am I finally getting back into a regular writing practice where I get back to it, you know, before I forget what I've written. It feels nice to be getting back into that again, but boy, it was a whammy for so many writers. I don't know about you,
Yeah,
Tommy.
well, I've heard that a lot of writers had a hard time in the pandemic. I wish I could blame the pandemic, but this novel I've been working on is taking me a long time. And I don't know, my process hasn't changed really. But yeah, it just hasn't changed. It's just like, okay, this isn't really finished. Okay, I gotta like start all over and do it again and do it again. And so for me, that's just what it's been. Yeah.
Yeah, and every book takes as long as it's gonna take.
Yeah.
It's like you think you can, you know, oh, I've done this before. I should be able to do it more quickly this time, and nah.
The novel I'm working on now, I started about 10 years ago. And then I wrote 2 YA books during that time. But then for the past 3 years, I've been working hard on this one novel. And, but yeah, it's like you work really hard and you think you're done, and then you're not done. And then, so what do? You just like give up, or you just go back to work. And I give up for about a day or 2 or a week, but I just can't stand it. And so then I just go back to work.
Maybe a puppet would help.
A puppet would be great. I would love a puppet. The puppet could write the damn thing. That would be even better.
You know, I did bring a puppet tonight.
All right. Where is she? Or he?
It.
It.
It's in my bag. I had to bring at least one puppet, right? And because my hands are like my father's hands, they're really big hands, and they don't fit in the puppet so good. But anyway.
Wow.
Yeah, so this, he says he would be happy to write the rest of Tommy's novel.
That'd be great. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, so he'll
How
go
much
home
would
with
he
you.
charge? Would he charge?
$3 a page.
Okay.
Very reasonable
All
rates.
right, that's very reasonable.
But yeah, I had to bring one puppet. This puppet, my dad gave this puppet to my
Oh.
mother earlier in their marriage.
Wow.
And there were 4 kids in my family, and we were total urchins. And if it had been our toy, it would not be here today for you to see it. But because it was my mother's toy, and we were not allowed to play with it except on very special supervised occasions, it has survived.
Does it have a name?
Yes, so in our family, this is Mutney Lulu, because my brother could not say monkey. And I actually looked him up on the internet this week, and his original name was Mungo.
Mm.
So there you go, you got a puppet. You wanted a puppet.
We have one more question from the audience, from Robin, who asked if you can talk about the characters.
Yeah, so the character of Sabine, I put her in there on a late revision because I realized in the book, 2 of the sisters had magical encounters. And I realized that the 3rd sister, Cora, had not had a magical encounter yet. So Sabine is an old homeless-like woman who is in Central Park and has a marionette that she's saved from a trash can. And she makes money by having the marionette feed the squirrels and tell fortunes and that kind of thing. And some of you may have seen, there are various older women like that who you can find online. It's amazing. They're feeding peanuts to the squirrels with their marionettes. So that was part of the inspiration. But I actually stole Sabine from the novel I'm working on now, which is a sequel to my first novel, Under the Mercy Trees. I had already created this character Sabine in that novel, and I was desperate for a character, and I love the name Sabine, so I just moved her right on into the Tears Daughters. Nothing is ever wasted. So that's where Sabine comes in. I like Sabine. She's got a little bit of magic to her. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have time for a couple more questions. If we've got, yes.
I've got one for you, Heather. So you said the agent sent the novel back about 4 times. So this is a two-part question. How close is this novel to the original draft that you wrote? And what are your tips or your tricks, or how do you get yourself into doing the revisions that you do?
How close is this to the original novel, the first polished draft that I sent her? Polished. I thought it was polished. Yeah, so I think the spirit is the same. I always knew how I wanted it to end and all of that. The revisions, I think, mainly had to do with making characters that people would care about. So I had to work pretty hard on that. Especially when you have 3 sisters, you have to distinguish them and their relationships and kind of track all that. So a lot of the revision was that. There was also some structural problems. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. It was kind of a torturous revision process, because every time I thought I'd gotten it where I wanted it to be, she would send it back, or we would get it back after a few more submissions, and try to figure out why, what's it going to take to make it sell. Yeah, I will say that the revisions came about after the pandemic had hit. And one interesting thing was I've listened to all these puppetry podcasts before the pandemic to write the first draft. Then when I needed to revise, I needed to add words to the book. And I went back and listened to a bunch more puppetry podcasts. And all of these puppeteers were out of work. Puppeteers make their living two ways. They either go into schools and teach, or they perform. Schools were all closed. There was no performing going on. All the puppeteers were at home sewing masks and putting their TV shows on with a iPhone in their closet. But from that, I got a lot more ideas that I could use to try to, make the characters a little more developed, figure out the relationships a little more. So it was kind of a good experience to get those 2 different perspectives after the pandemic hit. Deborah.
How do you feel about turning the Puppeteer's Daughters over to Sony?
Oh, if only I could turn the Puppeteer's Daughters over to Sony. So it's been optioned. Many books are optioned, and only a teeny weeny little subset are developed into a Netflix series or whatever. But and if it is developed, I will have absolutely no say so whatsoever, unless the producers are very kind and want to involve me in some way. But wouldn't it be cool? I don't care what they do with it. The only thing I wouldn't want them to do with it is to make a horror movie out of it, because the one thing I learned from writing this book and talking to puppeteers is that they get really irate when you say puppets are creepy. Don't say that. Don't say that to a puppeteer. So that's the one thing I wouldn't want is a horror movie, but they can do whatever else they want to do.
Absolutely.
I know you said this book was very therapeutic for you to write. In what ways did it impact you most, and how do you hope it impacts us as readers?
Thank you for that question. So I revealed that it was a therapeutic book, and how did it impact me, and how might it impact the readers? So the characters in the book are not like me or my dad, but the emotions of the relationship between Walter Gray and his oldest daughter, Jane, are a lot like the emotions between me and my dad.
Mm.
Because he was a hard person to be close to, just because of his personality. And there was always this unease and kind of, tightness in the chest when we were together. And so I drew on that and then I let them work it out. And I also, by that time, I had, a few years of perspective on my dad's passing. So I think by the time I got done, at one point, one of the characters says to Jane, her best friend, says to her that at some point you have to stop resenting what your parents couldn't give you and be grateful for what they could give you. And so I think I've arrived at that point.
Right. Right.
Thanks for that question.
I mean, it seems to me in some ways, I don't know, but that Walter is a way for the writer to reclaim something that they lost. When I wrote about somebody with Alzheimer's, it was also, it felt like, in a way, I brought them back,
Mm-hmm.
and they had life again and complexity. And it feels like that to me with this too.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that's what puppets do. And
Mm.
we infuse them with life. We bring them to life. Puppets actually have their roots in necromancy, bringing the dead to life. So it's interesting that you would phrase it that way.
Mm.
I'll steal that from you.
Oh, please do.
Celeste.
Both of you talked about thinking a book was finished and then having it say it's not. What does that feel like? Is it the characters coming to you going, hello, this isn't, like, what does that
It's not
feel
the
like?
characters, it's whoever reads it.
It's the characters that read it.
It's your
Yeah.
writing group or your editor or your agent or,
Yes.
yeah. It's those people that send you back to the drawing board.
Yeah. It's them.
It's not the puppets that are creepy.
It's the publishing industry.
It looks like we're done with questions. I don't have any more online. So final words from y'all.
Tommy, thank you so much for
It's
coming
been a
and
real
doing
pleasure.
this with me. And it's so wonderful to see so many faces in the crowd of friends and colleagues and family that some of whom I haven't seen since the pandemic hit. So I appreciate each and every one of you for coming, and the folks online as well. And thanks again, Malaprops, for making it possible and for all the support that you've given my books.